Hi, I'm Amanda Morgan, and this is Not Just Cute, the podcast, where we discuss all kinds of topics to help bridge the gap that exists between what we know and what we do in early childhood education. We're starting conversations with academics, authors, decision makers, educators, and parents so that together we can improve the quality of early childhood education, while at the same time protecting and respecting the childhood experience. Today, I'm talking with holistic psychologist and host of the Better Behavior podcast, Dr. Nicole Beurkens. As a special educator, clinical psychologist, and licensed nutritionist, she is the founder and director of Horizons Developmental Resource Center in Caledonia, Michigan. She's the author of the books Learning as We Grow and It Will Get Better. Dr. Nicole is passionate about helping each child thrive by attending to all aspects of health and wellness as she attends to brain-based challenges. In this episode, she's sharing her thoughts on a few things we can attend to in order to improve outcomes for every child as we move forward in this new school year. Before we jump in, a quick reminder that this is a fantastic time to start sharing those Why We Play letters. These letters will help you jumpstart important conversations in your learning community about the importance and power of play in your early childhood setting. I've been thrilled to talk with people from all over the United States and Canada and to hear ways they're using these letters to help others around them understand more about why play matters for young learners. I've said it before and I'll say it again, people don't value what they don't understand. If you want to help parents and colleagues understand the value of play, the Why We Play letters were created just for you. Learn more and grab a free sample letter at notjustcute.com/whyweplay. I'm excited for you to meet Dr. Nicole and to hear the passion she has for what she does. You can find this episode's show notes, which will be full of links and tidbits related to this episode, at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 53. If you're wondering how to thoughtfully prepare your classroom in a way that sets the developing brain up for success, you're in the right place. Let's jump in. Dr. Nicole, I'm so excited to talk with you again. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's been too long since we sat down and had a conversation.
It really has. And I was just realizing our last conversation was on your podcast. So I'll make sure that I link that. People may be saying, wait, I missed the first one. Where did we talk to her before? So I'll link that. And I'm sure people will find lots of other things that they can listen to from you. But I thought if we could, to start in, I think a lot of people have an idea of what a psychologist is. Maybe some don't. So that may be a place to cover. But particularly for you, your specialty is as a holistic psychologist. So could you start us out by explaining a little bit about what that is, what that looks like, and maybe even a little about the path that took you there?
Yes, because it's a winding path. And maybe some people can relate. My journey from college through my professional career to date has not been a straight line, as I think it's not for most people. But
right.
I started out in the world of education. I got my initial degree. My first bachelor's and master's were actually in special education and elementary education. So I started as a teacher and loved the work that I was doing in schools. I did some general education, and then I also spent some time developing programs and teaching in classrooms for primarily younger kids with significant emotional and behavioral disorders, autism spectrum disorder, severe ADHD, those kinds of things. Of course, there were way fewer of those kids back in the mid-90s than there are now. Mm-hmm. And then spent some time also working with high school age kids with severe learning disabilities, emotional impairment, those kinds of things. So was doing the school thing and then really got passionate about working with families. I was doing some really cool stuff with kids within the hours that I had them in the school day. And parents and family members were saying to me, like, we have them the rest of the time, like, we don't have resources. We're not sure what to do. And that really got me thinking about the role that families play, about the lack of support and education that they often receive. So that led me to go back and get my doctorate in clinical psychology because I really wanted to be able to work primarily with parents and families from the time that they first had concerns about their kids, all the way through the treatment process. So I went through a pretty typical traditional clinical psychology training program with an emphasis in child psychology and neuropsychology. So then opened a private practice. I've been working with kids through young adults and families for a lot of years now, 25 years. And I have a private practice. And that was all going along well. It's like, great, I've got my child development and my education background. Now I've got the psychology piece and the family systems background and the neuropsych pieces. And then I started to see a lot of commonalities in kids coming in where, yes, they were coming in to see me because of emotional or behavioral or cognitive kinds of issues. But as I was getting to know them more, as I was delving into more of their history, what I discovered is that so many of them had patterns of physical illness in their history, things like chronic constipation, chronic ear infections, had been on antibiotics for years, were super picky eaters, all of these kinds of things. And that got me really interested in, I wonder if there's, more going on there in terms of all these kids coming in with these quote unquote mental health or psychological behavioral issues, but also having these physiological things. And at the same time, by that point, I was a mom of 4. My kids are older now, 15 through 22, but at the time they were really young. And I started noticing with my 2 youngest some things. My one who had a chronic history of really bad eczema, and ear infections. And then my daughter who had a chronic history of ear infections and some other things, and started noticing some behavioral stuff and just some developmental things with them. And so that all sort of came together at a point where I was like, I want to delve into this more. So I started looking at the research literature on this and was really surprised to discover that actually and this was even 10, 12 years ago, a strong body of research connecting physiological health issues, immune issues, those types of things to learning, developmental, behavioral, emotional issues in kids. And it gave me pause because by that point, I had gone through a lot of training, right? I had a doctorate, I had 2 masters, I had been in the fields of education, child development, and psychology. And nowhere in my training had anybody talked about this. If we had learned a bit about the brain-body connection, it was more like from the standpoint of, well, exercise helps people with depression, which absolutely is true, but that was about the extent of it. And so I sort of felt at that point, like, wait a minute, how is it that we're not talking about this? And that got me passionate about really learning more for myself, not only to help my own personal children, but to better help the kids at my clinic. And eventually then a few years later, I went back and got a Master of Science in Nutrition and Integrative Health. I'm board certified in nutrition because it's that important. I actually, at this point in my career, don't know how to help people and do the best that I can for struggling kids and adults and families without incorporating a discussion and, strategies related to nutrition, sleep, overall health and wellness, stress, all of those things into the treatment plan. And so that's really how I practice today. I actually don't see too many patients myself anymore. My clinic does, but I do mostly teaching and consulting and those kinds of things. I do still have some patients that I see on a regular basis. And really, it's about this holistic approach of looking at the entire child or the entire adult, the entire human being, not artificially separating it out, which is typically how people think of it. It's like there's medicine and there's mental health. My child sees their pediatrician for things like eczema, constipation, allergies, headaches, whatever. And we go to the psychologist if they are not able to focus in school and they are behaving poorly and anxious and whatever. And when we look at it through a holistic lens, that differentiation doesn't make any sense because we've known for a long, long time now that the brain and the body are completely interconnected. What goes on in one totally impacts the other. So this idea that some things are medical and some things are mental health, some things are physical and some things are brain just doesn't make any sense. And when I talk about myself as a holistic psychologist, that's really what I'm getting at, that I look at the child as a whole person, their brain, their body, what's happened in the past, what's going on now, all of these pieces, and I'm very interested in understanding what's going on underneath the symptoms. And this is one of the distinguishing factors too. You know, if you're listening and you've been to see a child psychologist, or even for yourself have had experience with that, typically the experience is you go in, you fill out some paperwork and checklists, you do sort of an intake interview, and then you end up with a diagnosis for your kid. And they say, well, you know, this is the diagnosis. To me, and I'm a very strange clinical psychologist in this way, the diagnosis is the least interesting part to me, because symptoms are simply red flags that tell us that something is not working well for this child. It may be something intrinsic to them. It might be something in the environment around them. It might be something relational. It might be all kinds of things. And my job, as I see it, is really to dig into understanding, why is this child having these problems and these symptoms in the first place? So to me, saying, well, you know, you tick the boxes for these things and here's the label we give that. I mean, labels can certainly be helpful for some things, but what they're not helpful for is understanding, why is your kid struggling in the first place? And most importantly, what are the things that we need to do to support this child in improving in these areas? And that's where I like to focus most of my time and attention, and where I encourage parents to focus their time and attention, and teachers and everybody else working with these kids. Less about what's going on the surface, more about digging into what's going on underneath. And to me, that's really what I do as a holistic psychologist.
So many fascinating pieces in that. And I love in particular that holistic picture, right? Whether it's psychology or education or medicine or parenting, any aspect of dealing with another human being, that is often the challenge, is that we try to isolate, like you said, these little pieces of it. But every single human being, there are so many complicated factors, and whatever it is that we're trying to specialize in or focus on or address, we're going to be able to do it more effectively if we're willing to take a step back and look at those other parts, even if it's not our specialty, even if it's not what we think is our target, it's going to impact and influence. So as for teachers in particular, as they're listening to this, they're probably heading into a new school year if they're listening to it as it comes out. And one of the things that you address in looking at all of these different factors, and we've talked about how many things are in the environment that impact the way that any child experiences that day. And so I'm curious, as teachers are preparing and planning for this new school year, these early childhood educators, and as they're making decisions about how to prepare their room or how to schedule their day or how to, some of these choices that they do have that are going to impact and be these factors that influence young children, what are a few of the things that you would suggest for young or educators of young children to keep in mind in the environment to help set all children up for the most amount of success and the most enjoyable experience in these early years?
Oh, I love this question. And I love, I get, the joy of doing professional development for educators in general, but early childhood educators are some of my favorite, I will say. There's so many things that we don't have control over as teachers or as people working with kids. So it becomes really important to control the things we can and to create classroom environments and curriculums and school experiences for kids that allow them to thrive and do well, at least when they're, in those environments. We can't control we can't control anything about what goes on outside of that. So to say, okay, not going to get lost in the weeds with all the things that I wish were different for this kid or that I wish they had access to. Let me focus on what I can do here. And here are some of the things that I think are key. And when people say to me, yeah, but do this for these kids, but what about the rest of them? Here's the beautiful thing. When we are creating developmentally appropriate, brain supportive, healthy classroom environments and curriculums for kids, it's for all kids.
Exactly.
Anything that's going to help little Johnny in your class who bounces off the walls and is very dysregulated is going to help every other kid in your class as well. So that's maybe a helpful framework to start with, is this isn't about doing these things because a couple of kids need them. This is about creating an environment that supports learning and development for everyone. So One of the things that I'll say from a purely like physical environment perspective is there's several things that I have teachers and people who have control over the classroom environment that I have you think about. The first is the simpler, the better in terms of the visual and physical environment. I have been in early childhood classrooms and child development centers where, it literally looks like the teacher store like threw up all over the walls of this room. And we think that's cute and we think that's fun and whatever, but the reality is it's not brain compatible. Kids actually do much better from a sensory and a brain perspective when the environment is kept simple. So if you want to put, let's say, borders on your bulletin boards, for example, and you don't need to, I give you permission not to, but if you wanted to, make them all the same. You think about, I had this amazing, I had this just awesome student teaching experience when I did my gen ed student teaching. And she was a 5th grade teacher, and she was way ahead of her time in terms of brain compatible learning and understanding neuroscience and how to apply it to education. And that was back before we even knew like half of what we know now. But she told me, I remember walking into her room for the first time to interview with her. And I remember thinking, wow, this room feels so different. I was like, whew, the kids were calm. I felt calm. And she said something really important and that stuck with me. She said, you should decorate your classroom like you would decorate your home. She said, you would never, if you were redoing the decor in your home, you wouldn't put a different color curtain on every window. You wouldn't have all kinds of different patterns. You would not have things hanging from the ceiling. And it's so true. And so I think about that. And when I do consultations in schools, it's one of the things I really have teachers step back and try to take an objective look at, because sometimes we get blind to it. Keep things in neutral, calming, brain supportive colors, lighter colors or blues, greens, the bright reds, the oranges, the yellows. Look, we have data on that. That is alarming. Colors make a difference in terms of what it does to the brain. So you want to create this soothing, brain supportive atmosphere. I had in one of my classrooms when I was teaching young kids with autism. These were very severely impacted kids. And I was put in this classroom that had the worst fluorescent lighting in it. And it's interesting because the data has been so clear for decades now that fluorescent lighting is like toxic to the human brain. They've done controlled studies where they put kids in a classroom for 30 days with artificial fluorescent lights. They put kids in a classroom for 30 days with, full spectrum, healthier lighting. And the difference is night and day in terms of behavior and academic outcomes. But what do? We still have, terrible lighting. But not only was it fluorescent lighting all through the room, but some of them would flicker.
Oh, no.
And so one of the advantages that I had, he's now my husband, but we were dating at the time and he was an electrician and doing construction at the time. And so I literally had him come in because I kept saying, I need to fix this. And my administrator said, there's nothing yet. This is the lighting, whatever. And so I had him come in and he literally unscrewed and took 3/4 of the bulbs out so that when I turned the light on, there would just be a few fluorescent lights. And then I used natural lighting and lamp lighting, made a huge difference. Some of these things, I just was like, I'd rather ask forgiveness than permission. You're not going to let me do what I need to do. So I'm just going to figure it out. And if you get mad at me later, fine. So the lighting makes a big difference. Turn those artificial lights off whenever you can. Let natural light come in. Use full spectrum lamp lighting. Now they make some filters that you can hang over fluorescent lights too. It's amazing the difference that makes. So think about that. Stuff hanging from the ceiling. For kids with sensory processing challenges, that creates a level of complexity in the physical environment that neither you nor they will be able to articulate as a problem, but actually is functionally causing a problem. Because not only is that in the visual space, but every time, the door opens and closes, people move, there's wind, those things are moving. And for kids, with proprioceptive and vestibular issues who lose themselves in time and space, who struggle with feeling grounded, who are very dysregulated, that constant movement is not helpful for their brain and for their regulation. So take that stuff down. Be judicious about what you put on the walls. If it doesn't have a specific meaning or purpose right now for what you're doing, it doesn't need to be up. Kids will do much better in environments that are more simply arranged and put together. So from a visual, like aesthetic perspective, that's what you want to be thinking about. Also, get rid of things like air fresheners, candles, those kinds of things. Not only do they put more synthetic toxins into the physical environment, which some kids are very sensitive to, but again, it creates another layer that their brain has to process from a sensory perspective. And for kids who are already struggling with regulation and sensory processing, it's just another issue. So you want to think about noise. You want to think about comfortable seating, in early childhoods, not 10. And although I don't know, I shouldn't say that. I've gone into rooms with 2 and 3 year olds sitting at, tables and desks for lengthy periods of time. So, you want to be thinking about learning doesn't need to happen at a table or a desk. And in fact, it probably won't, especially not for our early childhood learners. So thinking about how do you set up spaces that allow for more active learning, that allow for movement. If you've got kids who are moving around all the time in their chair and falling off and whatever, the solution is not a sticker chart to try to train them to stay still in their chair longer. The solution is for us to realize, sitting still in a chair at a table for an extended period of time is actually a developmentally inappropriate expectation for a 3-year-old, a 5-year-old, a 6-year-old. I need to do something different here in terms of my planning of how I'm doing lessons, where I'm having kids sit. Can they be on the floor? Can they lie on their stomach, propped up on their elbows? Can I tape off what I like to call a pace space in the back of the room where, yes, you can get up and walk back and forth and move around. And here's what that looks like. And here's the boundaries, and you can access that. So thinking about what do we need to shift about where kids are supposed to be and, how they're positioned and what seating and workspaces are available for them, as opposed to setting up the same thing for everybody and then, tearing your hair out half the time with, a quarter of your class because that's not working for them. So I think, from a physical perspective, those are some important things. And then the big picture thing, and of course, like Amanda, this is like what your entire platform is about, is the developmental appropriateness, is really delving into an understanding for whatever age group you're working with. What should we be doing to support a brain at this stage of development? What is developmentally appropriate in terms of expectations? What's not appropriate to expect because their brain isn't ready for it yet? What should we expect because, their brain is there? And really delving into that. And unfortunately, I don't know if this is changing because it's been several years now since I taught at the graduate level and did teacher training in that way. So I don't know actually what people are being taught now, but, when I went through teacher training and for, so long, even beyond that, teachers are not really steeped in understanding child development. Which I take for granted. I'm so grateful for the background that I had in the program that I had, but I share often, even in the program I was in, when I went into to study human development, my professor who taught that introductory course, he said, "Now your background was in education?" I said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, you have a really great understanding of human development for somebody who studied education." And I thought that is not a statement that should be an assumption, right? That didn't make sense to me. And it's amazing. Like, we spend all of this time, and even at the childcare level, because I have had young adult patients who have gone through the process of becoming like certified in being able to assist and teach in childcare settings, let alone what's taught to people in elementary programs. Like your job is literally to help children's brains develop and learn. But what we're actually going to teach you is not how kids' brains work or how you need to support them. What we're going to teach you is how to develop lessons that relate to standardized testing you're going to have to give. Mm-hmm. We're going to teach you about academics. We're going to teach you all of these things that actually do not give you a foundation for understanding child brains, which is crazy when you think about it, but that's what we do. And that's why I really don't blame educators for coming out of school and teaching and setting things up in the way they do, because they're following instructions. They're doing what they were taught to do. And unless you're in a program like you went through or had some mentors like I did very early on, and my teacher training program was very much like I had professors who were way ahead of their time with that, like the rogue out of the box. I swear all of us in that program went on probably to make administrators tear their hair out everywhere because we just refused to conform to, the norm of how that stuff was done. But that's really what we need to be teaching educators to do. You need to understand the brains of kids. You need to, we should be having educators take a course in foundational, neurological concepts. Here's literally how the human brain develops through the lifespan, and particularly at these ages. Here's what that means. Let's really delve into how development comes about, because whether we're talking about reading or math concepts or behavior or take your pick, all of those things and the learning in those areas is rooted in adult-child relationships.
Absolutely.
Is rooted in kids having the opportunity to physically move and explore their environment. Is rooted in exposure to lots of hands-on real-world experiences. Well, wow, if that's true, then why are we putting 3-year-olds in front of alphabet charts and expecting them to sit there and do these things, and then wondering why by the time they hit kindergarten, they are having behavior problems and, you can't, it's like, because we're not actually giving them what their brains need. Mm-hmm. And so what you can do, what you do have control over, is creating lessons, creating experiences, creating a way that you operate in your classroom that provides as much of those opportunities as you can. Now, sometimes people say to me, well, but I choose curriculum and my administrator said, okay, look, so you play the game, like you do the things that you have to do, but where you do have choices and control, you make those choices. Mm-hmm. If my department chair says I have to have 5-year-olds get through all these stupid worksheets this semester, okay. But I have choices about how I can do that. I can bring you outside to do that. I can do lots of ways of doing that don't involve just sitting at a desk and doing those worksheets. So think outside of the box about, even if there are things that you are told you have to do, what can you shift around that to do those things in a way that is going to better support brain development, behavioral regulation for your students?
All of these are so key. And it's interesting because it's, again, as we've said before, these are the things that contribute to best development and best learning. And they also speak to that misbehavior piece or challenging behaviors. And I will often say that what we see as inappropriate behavior is often actually inappropriate expectations. And that's much of what you're talking about, that if we just take that time to think about what is an appropriate expectation and what do I have control over as we create this environment and these experiences. And I also appreciate, as you were describing how we prepare classrooms, you really were going through those 5 senses, right? If we can take the perspective of a young child, and go through those 5 senses, how do they experience our classroom in what they're seeing, what they're hearing, how they feel things, just going through all of those, I think it would go a long way for us, and to simplify, like you said, to really, because as you mentioned, whether it's a child who has particular challenges or not, all of those pieces of sensory input need to be processed. Yeah. And I think we take for granted some of those things that we've become to kind of habituate. So we don't see the things swinging from the ceiling, but another child in our room is watching every single movement. And particularly when they're in a new environment, they're going to be more alert, right? More a heightened awareness of everything.
Yep. Well, the thing is, we take for granted, like we look at it through the lens of our adult brain. Our adult brain has developed the connections, most of us, where we automatically tune things out. Now, if you talk to an adult with significant ADHD, they'll say, no, they still struggle with that. But most of us, we don't notice it because our brain filters it out. A 5-year-old, an 8-year-old, even a 12-year-old, certainly a 3-year-old, like their brain hasn't developed the connections to filter that. So all of this is coming in and has to be processed. I want to say two things to add on to what you just said. The first is when you said so many of these things the kids are struggling because of our developmentally inappropriate expectations. That is not just an opinion. The research is actually very clear about this. And I want people to really understand this. And I'll pick the studies that have been done around ADHD and this as an example. We have clear, consistent research around the fact that the youngest children in kindergarten, so the kids who are the youngest in their grade, end up significantly more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD or some other behavioral disorder or a learning disability than the kids who are middle or older in their kindergarten class. This wasn't just one study. This has been replicated, which really speaks to the issue of what we're doing in kindergarten and first grade and second grade classes in the first place in terms of its developmental alignment with kids' brains, but also the critical part of it, there needing to be a match between the child's developmental readiness and what they're being expected to do. And I've had kids that I've worked with at my clinic where they had a disastrous experience in kindergarten as a kid who had just turned 5. We regrouped, we put them back in another environment, had them redo kindergarten the next year now as a just turned 6-year-old, night and day difference. They were more ready to do that. So this is how important that developmental piece is. And this is part of the environmental factors around why we didn't used to see so many kids having these kinds of issues. Because when, I think you and I are probably somewhere in this, you're younger than me, but like when we were in school,
by much.
But when we were in school, kindergarten, I remember things about kindergarten. You know what I remember about kindergarten? Playing out in the sandbox. I remember my kindergarten teacher having this big refrigerator box with shapes that we would, play in. We had centers. I remember the dolls. I remember the typewriter, all of these things. Those are my memories of kindergarten. We took naps. We didn't go to school for 5 or 6 or 7 hours. I showed up at 9 and I left at 11:30. I have a PhD now. It didn't hurt me, right? And yet where are we now? At least in the state that I live in, mandated all day, every day kindergarten. That right out of the gate is developmentally inappropriate. And not only have we taken away naps and, whatever, you get one recess a day. We don't have centers anymore because what used to be the second grade curriculum is now what you're supposed to teach in kindergarten. So sit there and do your social studies worksheet and you just go, is it any wonder so many kids are struggling and so many kids get branded or brand themselves early on in their educational years as stupid, as class clowns, as the behavior problem, as somehow not able to learn, or just say, I hate school and I hate learning. Well, that's why, because we have shifted to this place where how could they be successful and feel good? And of course, there's always going to be a percentage who can. Most of them tend to be girls.
It's interesting, right?
Right. Because from a brain development perspective, that actually makes perfect sense.
There's a different match.
With neuroscience, what we understand now about how different parts of the brain develop in males and females at different rates, at different stages. And yet none of that is taken into account. And so that's a big piece of why so many kids struggle. And of course, when a child is feeling incompetent, when they're feeling unsafe, when they're feeling like a failure, when they're feeling bad about themselves, the natural thing is they're going to start acting out, right? So it's not a surprise. And when we start thinking about it in this way, you know, kind of going full circle to where we started, this is the getting to the underneath of it and saying, well, why might this be a problem for you? Why might you be struggling? Oh, there's actually a lot of reasons that make sense here. And so as a classroom teacher, whether a kid's getting diagnosed or not, whether they're doing therapy, you know, outside of school or not, for you to be able to start to dissect and look at this and develop the curiosity around why is this kid struggling? What might be going on there? And you don't need a PhD in clinical psychology or an MD in pediatrics or whatever to get curious and start to look at and figure that out, and then start to make some changes and try some things. I will always encourage classroom staff, for any kid who's struggling with anything, especially if there's a lot of challenging behavior things going on, always err on the side of dropping your expectations for academics and whatever else way down, and you focus on relationship building and trust building, and you focus on giving them opportunities to shine and to feel successful and good about themselves. And I don't care if that means being the helper that feeds the guinea pig every day. I don't care if that means they're the one that you send to, you know, run the errand. I don't care if that means we're going out and having relay races because that's an area that Sam shines in, and I want him to leave today feeling like he did something really well. I don't care what it is. That's where you focus, because all the rest of it can't happen until we build those foundations. So stop pushing at the things that clearly are not working and are not leading to improvement, and pull back and focus on that relationship and focus on where they can be successful, and that you do have control over.
And I think two really important things that you hit on there. One is when people hear things like that, pull back on the expectations for academics and build these other aspects. And I hear some people who kind of stiffen up a little at that and say, well, but we need the academics. And it's true. We're not saying don't teach academics ever, don't cover those things. But until we get the first part right, the other won't come. And so it's kind of a sharpen the saw type of a scenario, right? That we can keep trying to do this thing, and it will work a lot better if we back off, not drop it completely, but back off to sharpen that saw, to build the foundations, to build the connections, to help them build those positive experiences and get the brain right so that we can be more effective as we teach those. It's not saying we're going to, you know, play with Play-Doh until they graduate from high school because it makes somebody feel good about it. That's not what we're saying at all. But to back up and build those positive experiences in order to learn the right things at the right time. But when we get it out of order, we can't fix that. As it's so much easier to do it right the first way. Right. The other thing that was interesting is when you talk about children who are younger in their class having more challenges. And I've heard some people say, well, then that's why redshirting is great. We should redshirt our kids. And I'll link, there's a discussion I've had with Allison McDonald about this topic. And she emphasizes frequently that particularly as those of us who are in the classroom, and for parents as well, that the problem with that, as a parent, you do the best thing that you can for your child. So if that includes redshirting, you do what you can. But the bigger issue is that if our system is requiring children to redshirt in order to be successful, then there's something wrong with the system. Amen. And so I want to make sure that people hear that whether it's as a parent or a teacher, that, you know, that teachers aren't saying, oh, well, we write off these younger ones, that's why they're so hard because there's something wrong with them. That's not what we're saying. No. It's because we need to be able to create an environment and a system that is supportive of those youngest learners in those environments. And that when we start to see big, you know, skewing that way, we need to reflect on that in our own environment. And how can we be prepared for those children?
That's right. That's exactly right. And it goes back to something we talked about earlier in the conversation of, we like to blame the kid and say the problem's in the kid. No, the problem's in the system. The problem is that the entire system of education in this country needs to be completely dismantled and but people talk about reform, people talk about change. I'm like, look, that ship sailed. The thing needs to be burned down and we need to start over. That's how off track we are with so much of this. And as a teacher, you don't have control over a lot of that or any of that. As a parent, you don't either. So you do the best you can with the parameters that you're given. But, ultimately, you're exactly right. At a systems level, we need major changes, because if we've got kids coming into a system where the system is not set up to support them, that's a systems level problem. And the other piece I'll say here is for kids with neurodevelopmental differences, for kids with developmental delays, for kids with conditions that involve cognitive impairment, this discussion around developmentally appropriate is especially important for them. Because these are kids who are not going to experience success in school environments unless we are understanding developmentally where they are at. And that may be very different than their chronological level. I may be teaching third grade. So I've got a lot of kids who developmentally are 8-ish, give or take. But I may be working with an autistic student or a student with Down syndrome or whatever it might be who developmentally is 3.
Right.
If I'm going to try to take a developmental, a kid who's developmentally 3 and put the expectations on them of being developmentally 8, that's not going to go well. And I need to look at that and realize, well, of course that's not going well. And of course he's tearing up his paper and running around and whatever. So what do I need to do to grow this kid where he or she is at with that developmental level? And boy, do I get as a teacher that it feels unfair a lot of the time to have to figure that out, especially if you have a class of 30 kids and lots of different things going on. I get it. But this becomes the work then, because you cannot expect a kid whose brain is here and primed and ready for learning at this level to suddenly be able to do this. I have a PhD in psychology, but if you put me in a graduate level physics class right now, my brain is not developmentally ready or able to do that. I am going to experience massive failure. And it's not because I'm stupid. It's not because I'm not trying or I don't want to. It's that I have my knowledge and ability to do that is here. And you're asking me to do this. So some things are going to have to happen there to get me ready for that. And that's how we have to think about this with kids. And especially as we have more and more learners in our classroom environment with brain differences, with developmental challenges, it's not just thinking about this issue of development. Well, are you ready for kindergarten at 5 or do you need to be there at 6? It's really looking at the entire class of learners in terms of their developmental readiness, where they are. And so I get that that's a challenge, but it's also a necessity.
And I think that really brings us full circle at looking at the individual again, that when we talk about developmentally appropriateness, I think that's one of the big misconceptions around that is that there's a one size fits all developmentally appropriateness. And there are general principles that maybe apply to all third graders or wherever group you want to put it with, but really inherent in developmentally appropriateness is that we are looking at each individual where they are and what they need, and that we focus more on supporting them and giving them what they need than we are on what we want to see or get out of it as a performance, that we really focus on supporting and building these young children. And I just appreciate you've shared so much with us here, and you have so much more to offer. And I'll be sure to link your podcast, your site, your book, all of these things, because I'm sure people are going to be ready for more and more. But just thank you so much for all that you've shared here and in your work to really advocate for children, just as we said, getting what they really need and us being curious and asking the questions that need to be asked so that we can get those things for them. So thank you for your time and thank you for your work.
Oh, thank you for having me. This was great.
Thanks again for listening to Not Just Cute, the podcast. You can find show notes at notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 53. There you'll find links to some of the research we discussed today, as well as other fascinating tidbits that I know you'll love. You can also hit up the show notes for a link to the Why We Play letters. Head to notjustcute.com/podcast/episode 53, or go straight to notjustcute.com/whyweplay to get signed up and download your free sample letter. The Why We Play letters will help you start conversations and advocate for developmentally appropriate, play-based early education. I'm Amanda Morgan. You can read more on my blog and sign up for the Not Just Cute newsletter at notjustcute.com. You can also stay tuned for social media updates on Instagram by following me at Amanda_NotJustCute. Thanks for listening today, and as always, thank you for standing up for children and for childhood.